pleasure to welcome everyone to these Lunch and Learns. And I do want to remind you that we host a Lunch and Learn every second and fourth Tuesday. And we have wonderful people that come and talk about many fascinating parts of our community. So I hope that if this is your first, it won't be your last. And if it's not your first, I hope you just keep on coming back because we love having you. A couple housekeeping announcements. If you need a restroom, there is one just right outside that back door. And if you would like any sort of refreshment, we have some coffee, waters, I think a little sweet treat in the back, and you can help yourself at any point. All right, I will also tell you, I feel like my sound is weird. Are we okay? All right. So our next Lunch and Learn, for those of you who need to keep track of these things, September 12th. Okay, so we have a little gap here, second and fourth Tuesdays. So this September 12th, we will have Bob Taylor, who is the author of From Service to Success, and he also runs a nonprofit that helps veterans. So that should be very fascinating as well. But today, I'm excited to have Jerry Gonzalez with us to talk about St. Joseph's Parish, which I was just sharing I find to be just a great, fascinating community history. And I have just learned that he did a whole PBS show about all of this too. I didn't know that, and I'm like really interested. So hopefully we can all go find that online, and if not, we can all ask Delta to like re-air it because I want to.
They actually will be re-airing that. Let's see, on the 7th of September, as well as on the 9th, I think.
Okay.
But
there you go.
I had asked them to do that so they could reintroduce it. That was during the dedication of the parish in 2003.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad to hear they are already going to do it. So anyway, I've been able to chat with Jerry a little bit, and I think he said hi to so many people. You probably know him better than I do, but retired mechanical engineer, yes?
Correct.
And he's been working on this history for like 20 years. Even when I was over at Hoyt Library, I was like, yeah, we're going to do this thing. Do you have anything I can read on it? Librarians were like, well, you really should talk to Jerry. I'm like, I know. So you have the reputation being the man with this history, and I am so happy you're willing to share it with us. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you. And as she said, well, the full name is Gerardo Gonzalez, but Jerry is a lot easier for most people to say. So unless you're really good at rolling your R's. But as she said, I am a graduate of St. Joe's. I'm a 1967 graduate, and I've done just about everything there. I was baptized, confirmed, served as an altar boy, and a lectern, and JV and varsity basketball. And then after that, I started the life, and so I became, a lifelong resident of the area. I'm a retired mechanical engineer with Saginaw Steering Gear, now called Next Year. And then I've been on several different boards. So without that, to go forward, what we're going to do today is talk about just an outline of the history of St. Joe's. And the reason I say an outline is because I'm actually trying to put a book together that will cover the history of St. Joe's. And it goes a little bit beyond that because chapter 1 is parish history, and the parish history is going to include the start of Catholicism in the Saginaw area, all the way to the development of this parish, and then going forward. And then chapter 2 is the school of history, and then we bring the Dominican sisters for the first time to Saginaw in 1885, and so they're a part of the start of our school, basically, or the introduction of our school. And then I touch on the diversification of the parish because we go from an Irish community, and we were like over 95% Irish when we started, and then we went from that to what we are today. So I sort of talk about what caused those changes. And then the next chapter is really on the Guadalupe Clinic and also the introduction of the Sisters of the Holy Spirit. At that time, they're called Sisters of the Holy Ghost. But that's brought in, and then we started a federal credit union to take care of the needs of not only the parish, but later the community. And that was because it was a low income and most people couldn't get loans at that time. So that's why we covered the credit union. And by the way, it was the very first federal credit union for the Catholics, I should say. And then community housing, there's a project that Monsignor Bolton was involved in, basically integrating the people that were going to live there. And then parish groups, I just showed the changing groups that go through. And the last chapter is still up in the air because things are changing, so the history won't be developed until I finish the book. So with that parish history, I wanted to start out and tell you that we started with the Archdiocese, or at that time, the Diocese of Detroit. They started the diocese in Michigan in 1833. We're founded in 1873, so at that time, that was the only diocese in the state of Michigan. And so we're under them until the Diocese of Grand Rapids is formed in 1882. And then we now fall under that diocese. And Detroit takes the southern half of the state of Michigan, and Grand Rapids had the upper. And we were included in that. And then, of course, our diocese isn't formed until 1938. And so that's when we now, where we're at now, Diocese of Saginaw. But, and I'm bringing this up, this was in the 1948 booklet that Monsignor Bolton put out for the Diamond Jubilee, or the 75th anniversary. It says, "To the brave and sturdy Irish pioneers whose fervent faith and unselfish sacrifice built St. Joseph's Church, and to their worthy successors of every national origin who are maintaining St. Joseph's Parish in the same spirit of living faith and undaunted courage." This is 1948. If you have to remember the racial climate at that time, there was a lot of prejudice in that. So this is a very powerful statement in 1948. That's why I thought it was great to show that. So here we go. The very first church, September 7th, 1873. So the top picture is that of the original church. And then in 1919, at an exorbitant cost of $2,500, they remodeled the church. And they actually built the church that we knew over the top of the church that's above. It was a wooden structure. And when they tore that St. Joseph's Church down, the one that we're familiar with, the wooden structure was still under there. So, and then of course the new church is dedicated on April 6th, 2003. And as she mentioned, we did a show on Somos Hispanos, Delta College, Channel 19, on basically the history that I'm showing you here. A little more brief because it could only last 25 minutes. Okay, I'm just going to go through the pastors. Now, many of you that are familiar with St. Joe's will have a lot of the priests that you're familiar with, but these are only the pastors. There was a lot of associate priests that were involved also. But, and I'm doing it in the order that they were in the buildings. So this building is up in 1873. Father Sweeney is our first pastor. And then Father Whalen up to 1916. And then his brother goes through and becomes the pastor of St. Joe's, and he's the one that has it remodeled. And then, of course, Father Malone, and we go to Father Sharansky, Monsignor Bolton, Father Lamar, Father Morales. Many of you remember, at least some of you can go all the way back to Father Malone that were graduates. We still have some around here. Yeah. Then in 1966, we get the first Capuchin priest. And so that's Father Malcolm Maloney that comes in. And that happened to be my senior year, so that's why I remember it quite well. And then Father Freegan, and then Father Pesh, Father Stewart, and then, as many of you know, Father Dan. Uh, and, um, and then Father Dan is the one that really starts with the development of the new church. But then he moves to Detroit as head of that order. And then Father Petramo was only there a year, the year that we dedicated the parish. And then Father Trejo, and then Father Dan comes back. Then, of course, unfortunately, he passes away from a heart attack. And now we have Father Frank Borges. So that's the progression. And as you see the buildings, they come in with the pastors that served within those buildings. School history. Many of you thought that the building that was on 7th Street, or actually on Sears and 7th, was the first school, and that's not true. The very first school was actually on Potter Street. It was at the very end of the, this is the best picture I could find. It's an 1877 map of a hand-drawn map of the east side of Saginaw. And so if you come down, Potter Street is only from Washington to 3rd Street. And as you come down to the very end, you dead end and go over the tracks to 3rd Street, or on 3rd Street over to Sears. That building was right at the end there. It was, and the only reason I was able to find that, because in the 1948 booklet that was put out, they mentioned that the first school was run by Ms. Caldwell, and she had 20 students in a 2-story building, and at the on Potter Street. So when I looked at it, this is the only building that fit that description. So the reason I can't show you or I can't find the information on the property is because the city hall here in Saginaw burned down to the ground in 1935. And when that happened, many of the records were lost with it. Then the school that most of us knew was built in it was built in 1885, and then that's served for the younger generation, which we're not young anymore, but for the younger generation, that was our cafeteria, that was our gymnasium, and some activities were also done in there. So that's what that building was used for. But originally, and in 1948, the top floor of that building burnt and it was rebuilt. Then in 1915, this new school was built, which is the school that I remember. And of course, it was there until the closing in 1971. It eventually gets torn down in 1990. And then the only other school that was added was the intermediate school. That was brought in 1963. And that is now the hall of the new church. The rooms were completely taken out and it turned into a hall and cafeteria and things like this. So this is just a quick overview. These are all the principles of St. Joe's Parish over time. Now, I say principles because we don't really get a principal until 1885 because that's when the Dominican sisters come to actually teach at St. Joe's. And they're the very first Saginaw County school that they teach at is St. Joe's. And we're the first to also give them a convent to live in. But anyway, we go through all the nuns down to Sister Ardith Platty, who at that time was, when I was a senior, was Sister Richardine. Now, these pictures I put because what happened when the school went vacant after the adult education program ceased there, we used to have pictures in the hallway of all the senior classes. And unfortunately, they were told that if you want something in the building, take it. And all the pictures pretty much disappeared. And they were the original class photos. I found a couple of them. We have the 41 and 42, and they're monstrous. They're like 3 feet by 2 feet in size. But anyway, that's I put this slide because I'm not only presenting, but I'm searching. I'm trying to find the original photos. So that's why I said, what happened to these pictures? Now, as far as the class list, I've developed a generator, an Excel, that I can basically, if you give me a name of a last name as an example, I can throw that in there and I can show you every year that a person with that last name graduated. Or if you give me a class year, I can tell you everybody that was in that class in that year, starting from 1893 all the way to the closing of 1971. So I do have that available. And this is just my checklist of those pictures. I have about not quite 60% of all the class pictures. And the reason we don't have them all is because there were some years, and I don't want to throw names out there, but Sister Isadora did not believe in class photos. So for about 7 years, there was no senior pictures taken at all. And so that was sort of a blank year. The only pictures that were taken were individually by the students if they wanted one. So and this is an example of the class photos, and I just put a list of the years I have or don't have. But the one that you see there, let's see, that's a 1926 photo. And by the way, one of the gentlemen in there is John Redmond, the start of the Redmond gas stations here. And then, because it's my presentation, my class list is the one at the bottom. So now, Dominican sisters, they have an interesting background. They actually started in Germany, and then they moved to New York in 1853 and set up a mother house there. And then they sent Sister Agnes Fiegler, or Aquanata Fiegler, to the Saginaw area, well, not Saginaw area, to Michigan, to the wilderness, because they wanted to basically, they were teachers, and they were asked to come to Traverse City and reside there and teach. And that was their first foothold in Michigan. But in 1883, when the Diocese of Grand Rapids formed, the bishop there asked them to move to Grand Rapids, and that's why Marywood and Aquinas College and that are there. They moved there, and that's where they've been ever since. And and then our first pastor, Father Sweeney, goes through and he requests in 1877 to have the sisters come in and teach. The problem is that the sisters were still developing or trying to recruit more young ladies to be nuns. And so they weren't able to provide St. Joe's with teachers until 1885. And all the sisters that came in, I have their names down here. There was 5 sisters that came in, and they were Sister Gabriel O'Malley. Notice that many of these names are Irish. Justina Daly, James Walsh, Eleanor Heinel, and then Alexa Flynn. And I was only able, I found the history on all 5 of the sisters. I called Marywood to get that information. And, but I only could find 2 pictures of the 5 that did come, which are also in this presentation and will be part of the history. Now, diversification, as I said, the Irish, it was an Irish parish when it first started. And the reason for that is because most of the Irish immigrants were the ones that helped build the Pierre Marquette Railroad, better known as the Potter Street Station. And so they lived on that side of town. And the only Catholic parish on the east side of Saginaw was St. Mary's. And so they would go to church there. And so we start out as an Irish Catholic community for St. Joe's. Matter of fact, the very first society, like we have the Altar Society and that, but the very first society in 1873 was the St. Patrick's Society. Who would guess, you know? Then, in 1918, Saginaw Products, which is later to become the Gray Iron Foundry, is brought in by General Motors on Washington. And the problem with the foundry is, if you've ever been to a foundry, if you're pouring iron, and at that time they were using ladles, which was very hot work to do. Most of the residents didn't want to work in the summer in that environment. So what General Motors did is they went through to the south and they recruited blacks from the Carolinas and areas like that, and they trucked them over to work the summer in Saginaw, and they lived on the premises of the foundry at that time. And then at the end, and families couldn't come, it was just the men. And then at the end of summer, they would truck them back. But at that point, what happened was, like anything else, people wanted to stay, you know, in the area, and St. Joe's was an inviting parish. Not as inviting as we would think. The reason it was inviting is because more of the religious staff or the pastors were influential in doing that. As you know, the community, not so much, but so there was that kind of an issue going on at first, but it started to grow in 1918, or started to change, I should say. And these are just some workers to show you, some of them pouring iron in the foundry. But the Sugar Beet Cooperative brought the migrant workers here, but that wasn't all of the reason for them being in the area. They also, many of them, or a portion of them, worked in the foundries too, because they said this is better paid than working in the fields, and it's you know, it was better overall. So what they did is many of them worked in the foundry also in those type of jobs. And so now we're starting to we've gone from an Irish to a black to a Hispanic community, and all melting about the same time. And I bring this up because we talked to some prejudice. At the time, pew fees were a common occurrence in most parishes. So basically, instead of passing the plate around and taking the collection, what they would do is that parishioners would buy a pew. And when they bought that pew, they're the only ones that sat in that pew. So the issues that most of our relatives or friends encountered at first was that they couldn't sit anywhere in the church. They had to sit in the back of church, stand in the back of church, and because they weren't allowed to sit in the seats. And that was part of it, is because they were bought by parishioners at the time. And then Monsignor Bolton was not happy with that because he just felt it was unchristian. But just to give you an idea of what that meant to the parish, this is a 1893 financial report for St. Joe's. And at the time, parish or the pew fees brought in $2,536. But if you go with the inflation, and this is what I did in 2016, that would be equivalent to $64,116 today. So it was a hefty amount for the time. And but as I mentioned, Monsignor Bolton didn't care for that, and he just thought it was unchristian because everybody should be able to enjoy the church or the services. Yes? If you did, you were usually ejected, and you know, most people knew that they couldn't sit in those pews. Okay, and because I heard some stories where, you know, and some of our parishioners from St. Joe's, when they were little, they said, "Oh, I'm gonna, you know, I want to sit there," and their parents would say, "No, you can't do that," because they knew what the setup was. All parishes? I'm only going with, I said it was a customary thing in many parishes. I'm not saying all parishes. But it was true at that time at St. Joe's. Yeah, they would have a name like O'Brien or whatever would be on the pew. So now we have another chapter that comes in, and that chapter is called the Guadalupe Center. And with the Guadalupe Center, we bring in the Mission Sisters of the Holy, at that time the Holy Ghost, now called Mission Sisters of the Holy Spirit. And this is a long one, but just to give you an idea, it was actually sponsored by the League of the Catholic Women, who took this challenge on. Monsignor Bolton brought them the problem that they were having, and it was a high death rate amongst Mexican infants. The rate for Mexican infants was roughly what's that 65 mortality rate. It was 36 for every 1,000 children. That was the mortality rate for the general population of Saginaw County. But for the Mexican clientele, it was 165 children for every 1,000. So it was pretty dramatic, you know. And Monsignor Bolton didn't think that was right, and they had to do something. A lot of that had to do with, you have to remember, this also includes the migrant families that are coming in, and the living conditions weren't that well. And they weren't familiar with pre or postnatal care or anything like this. And so that's what they wanted to do, was educate, the mothers on that kind of subject, but also they also decided to do birthing and that there. So a lot of babies were born at the Guadalupe Center. And then, so the first year it was run primarily by volunteer help, and then afterwards. They found that after almost a year of operation that they needed more staff. They needed more permanent staff because everything was volunteer. And that's when Monsignor Bolton basically got with the Sisters of the Holy Ghost at that time. They were from Cleveland. And then the bishop at that time, Bishop Murphy, okayed that and said, yes, we will do this. And so they talked to Sister Jean, who was the Mother Superior in Cleveland, and she said that she would send 2 sisters down. And the 2 that came down were Sister Pauline and Sister Agnes. And Sister Pauline actually spoke Spanish, and she also was a registered nurse. So, and then Sister Agnes was the one that went out to talk to families, do social work, but also listen to the medical issues that they were having and bring that back. So that's the first 2 sisters that worked at the Guadalupe Clinic. And then just to give you an idea, the first building, which is called Hope, that's dedicated by the League of Catholic Women in 1945, November 29th, 1945. And actually, Mrs. Deisler, who at that time was Mrs. Deisler was the chairman of the League of Catholic Women, and Mrs. Nicodemus was the president at that time when this occurred. But she's the one that goes up and actually puts the sign on the building and helped to purchase a building. This is all done on the property of St. Joe's. This is on 7th Street, behind the church. And then Faith was the middle building, and that was the residence that they gave the sisters to live in. That was their mother house for the start of this period. And these were small buildings too. They were more like 1,200 square feet, and that's about it. And then the third house was brought in, and that was on the very end of the 3 houses. And again, all on 7th Street. And that was used as an overflow for the medical center because they really had a lot of people that went through that area. But they also used it as a charity, and they collected clothing, food, And this was all given based on, if you couldn't afford it, it was free. And they took donations, and that was about it. So that's why they were dubbed Faith, Hope, and Charity for the buildings. Then, as I mentioned, the buildings were very small, and they just couldn't accommodate the kind of, people that were coming into the clinic. So the city of Saginaw donated the property on Wadsworth, and the building was the construction of the building was paid by donors, and this became a community center, and it was run by the last mission sister to run the Guadalupe clinic was Sister Lucia, and Sister Lucia was one of two that ran this when it first started. But Sister Lucia, because it was a combined effort, it was the Guadalupe Center and the First Ward Community Center is what this served. But when you started to mix the two together, eventually there was conflict. So the mission sisters backed out of that at that point after several years. Now we get into a federal credit union. I bring up these pictures. The two most important people were Monsignor Bolton and Monsignor Clement Kern. And that name I didn't know. It was not until I interviewed Father Lamar that he was able to give me more insight as to how the credit union got started. Monsignor Clement Kern was a priest from the Detroit area that was very familiar with banking and financing and credit unions. And so Monsignor Bolton talked to him because the reason this was started was because to get a loan for the low-income community that they were serving was near impossible because people, you have to have equity. And if you're low income, you don't have any equity, And so they couldn't get loans. And one of the examples that Father Lamar mentioned was that he had a lady that came to him and her husband had passed away, worked in the foundry, but the foundry didn't have the benefits and such that they have today. So her husband died, and as you know, most of the breadwinners at the time were male. And so she had no income when he passes away. It cost about $2,000 to bury a person at that time. And basically she was broke. She couldn't afford that. She'd be in debt for the rest of her life if she did that. So, and most often they couldn't even get a loan. So Monsignor Bolton thought that this is not right. So that's why he looked into finding some kind of a financial institution that would cater to the low-income people. And that's why they started the credit union. And it was the very first federal credit union. Everybody thinks that Catholic Federal and that was the second credit union that was started, again by Monsignor Bolton. This goes to a community center, and I'll show you that. And this is sort of a timeline. This is now what's called the church office at St. Joe's. But at that time, in 1949, this was the Federal Credit Union. And it doesn't really get built until I'll show you the timeline. Monsignor Bolton is meeting with Monsignor Kern in 1948 because it is eventually chartered in 1949. So it becomes an official federal charter. And then in 1950 is when they have their first member meeting for the credit union. And then in 1956, Monsignor Bolton transfers to St. Mary's Cathedral as pastor there. And in 57 is when this building, which is now the church hall, but the structure wasn't erected till 1957. Then in 1970, they decided that they still ran it in this building, but they were now going to open it to the community and try to maintain the same kind of loaning, to individuals based on trust and faith, which didn't work out. Once it became public, people had a hard time, or sometimes refusing to pay their loans. And for that reason, the credit union was really hurting, and they even had threats against their lives when they tried to collect loans. And so in before I get to that point, 1974 is the 25th anniversary. And then in 1978, it officially closes, and that's because the charter has to go to the end of the year. But in 1977 is when all this is occurring, and I pulled the news articles. I'm not going to go through all that because it would take too much time, but they eventually dissolved the credit union and the charter at that point. Community housing. The reason I bring this up, and this is not going to show you much other than a timeline, and this is, I'm using Monsignor Bolton because he was instrumental in all this. He comes to the parish in 1944 and he's there till 1956. He's elected as a member of the Saginaw Housing Commission in 1951. And his commission was from October 51 to 1961. Interestingly enough, and I throw this in there, if you notice April 1951 to 53, William R. Hart was the Saginaw mayor. He's also a 1932 graduate of Saginaw St. Joe's. I wonder if that didn't help Monsignor Bolton get on the commission, okay? And I can't tell you if it did or didn't, but you would think. And then they were building this new housing complex, and it was going to be, the veterans were in that area, and the housing had gotten pretty bad, and so they were going to demolish that and put them in this new housing project that was going to be called the Norman Street Project, or a housing development, I should say. And that is what was going to occur, but it was going to be primarily white. And Monsignor Bolton was given the opportunity to write the editorial for Christmas, for the end of the year, by the Saginaw News. And he sort of shamed them a little bit in an article. And that's in January 1st of 1953. The article was the God-given law responsibilities upon every citizen protects, imposes. And I didn't carry it all on because it's a long one. But basically, he goes through and says, this is a diverse community now. The people should have the opportunity to live in this area. And so that eventually did change. And now we know that as the Daniel Heights area. And this is an example of there's Monsignor Bolton there, and there's actually that's Mr. And Mrs. Earl King, and their son, one of their sons, what I know quite well. We call him Al King, but it's Carl King. He's a surgeon now in California, but these are his parents. They were the first, or one of the first families to sign their property over because it was in the area where this project was going to go. So that's why this picture is there. They're signing their property over, and later they do become residents of the project too. This is a poor view because it's all I could get out of the Saginaw News, but it gives you an overview of what the projects look like from the air at that time. And just to give you an idea, we're talking about the diversity a little bit. The red box, that's the Pierre Marquette Railroad or Potter Street Station. All right? This yellowed area, that's the property of St. Joe's. That's basically the church, the school, everything. This is the Norman Street projects right there. And this is the foundry. So all that is what brought the current population that they have, or the residents, or the diversity of that area, was because it was central to all of the things that were happening there. Parish groups. Now this, I'm not going to get a lot into, but I want to just show you over time how things have changed. I take this one from the 1948 booklet. Now don't forget what's happening in 1948. Just after the war, there was still a lot of war things going on as far as groups. But we have the Holy Names Society, Men's Club, Ushers Club, Athletic Association, Catholic Benevolent Association, Mother's Victory Club, there's part of the war, Solidarity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Our Ladies Club, Legion of Mary, which was a black organization, St. Peter Claver, which is also another black organization, Knights of Our Lady of Guadalupe, name changed, but that's what they were called at the time, Legion of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Actually, the Legionnaires of Our Lady of Guadalupe, that's what's now called the Damas of Guadalupe. Los Compañeros, anyway, it was a senior club in school, is what it was. And then there's another, and I can't get all these names all correct, but it was another Mexican club that was at the parish. This is 1948. Now, in 2003, when the new building is dedicated, we have youth and religious education, Damas and Caballeros. We have Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver, prayer group and prayer line, Eucharistic ministers, lectors, evangelization team, Knights of Columbus, Crucistas, music ministry, women's club, Isidoras, and jail and prison ministry. So you can see that what's going on and the type of groups that are formed have changed considerably. Now, just to show you this is a Legion of Mary. Again, it was a black organization. And the reason that we're doing that is because there was still, I don't want to say segregation, but it was inclusive, to do the cultural thing, like we did Las Damas, Guadalupe, we did the Caballeros, the Guadalupe, that was the Mexican culture there. And then they wanted to do something with the members of the black community of St. Joe's, so these societies were started for that reason. Again, it was to sort of stick with the cultural theme. Now, some of these pictures you'll see, this is a men's club, and of course, this was out of the 1973 booklet of St. Joe's. And some of you that were St. Joe's members would recognize a lot of faces that are in there. The Isidoras, that was a black organization, and it was started actually with the help of Sister Isidora, who was principal for about 7 years. And that's because the ladies didn't really have a forum to meet and also to do community service, so they formed the Isidoras to do that. The Knights of Peter Claver, again, that was a men's organization for the black community, and this is one of the newer pictures. I think this one was 1988 is where that one comes from. The Damas, again, this is taken out of which one is that? Anyway, the names are down there, and then we get a religious singing group called La Rondalla de San Jose, and that was started in 1970, and which continues today, even though they lost a lot of members. References, I just want to show you in reference, the 1948 booklet had a lot of history. I found a lot of errors because I've been doing this for quite a few years, and so some of the newspaper articles they referred to weren't always correct. But anyway, I also went to Marywood, to the Dominican Sisters, and got their Diamond Jubilee booklet, which gave me a lot of information about St. Joe's. And then, of course, Saginaw News and the public libraries were helpful with what I'm doing. What I want to show you here, right here. And I'm not going to go through all this because it'll take forever to get through this thing. There's 105 slides in this thing, so it's not worth showing everything. But this is a program, and I'm just going to run real quick through it. It's talking about this, the various, how the school got started and things like that, but it will go all the way through and show every class from 1893. I have a few pictures of the very early class, and then all the way to the closing. So, like I said, it's 105 slides, and I won't go through that. But the other thing I wanted to show you, okay, come on back. Okay, remember I talked about a generator there? Anyone here know a St. Joe's graduate? Or give me a last name.
Packard.
I'm sorry?
Packard.
Packard, okay. Let's put that in. I'm going to look for last name.
Gerardo.
There's 11 of those. That one I know real well. Packard, okay, there we go. So we're going to say, okay. Let me move that up. Okay, the very first graduate with a Packard last name was Albert. He was 1912, and he was the only graduate in 1912. Oh, too far. No, hold on. I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing here. So, you can see that if we go through the Packards, let me get back there. I think I just lost them. Okay, we have okay, we start with Albert in 1912. In 1924, you have one, 1930, 32, 38, 1940, 41, 42, 43, 44, 47, 48, 51, 2 and 51. Yep. And by the way, I know a few of the Packards, and I've given them this list of their family members. But
Redmond.
now Redmond is one of the original starting families, or close to the starting families. So if we look at Redmond, the first Redmond was the very first graduate. There was 2 girls, and Kitty Redmond was one of the 2 graduates in 1893. And then 1923, Margaret is the oldest of the parents or aunts and uncles of the current Redmonds. But Margaret was a 23, and then John Redmond and Ken Redmond, who both ran the Washington garage, the Redmond station. Ken, John is a 26 graduate, Ken is a 28 graduate. The problem there is that Ken in 1928, he was 38 years old, and he passes away, and he has 3 children, and then his wife passes away a month later. And so John winds up raising not only his kids, but also all of Ken's kids. And so they knew John as their father, pretty much. And they're still considered. I've talked to many of the Redmonds. Matter of fact, I did a whole history on them because of their great-great-aunt being one of the first graduates. And of course, Mary Redmond was a late in life baby, and she was the last of that group. And I do have their names, the children's names too, but not.
Only actually graduated, or anybody that
Anyone that graduated from St. Joe's that I found official records on, and I've checked the newspaper, but I went through all the records at St. Joe's. No. If he graduated, if he attended, that's one thing. But this is only graduation, is what I'm looking at. So, yeah, I do. Oh, I'm seeing a stand up there. Do I have a few minutes? What's that? Okay. Let me just back out here. Let me see how I put the O'Donnell in there. That one I'm going to have to check because I do have it, but I forgot if I have to put the O dash or whatever. Let me back up here. What was the last name? Caesar? Or first name or the last name? Caesar?
that's the last
Is it spelled C-E-S-E-R-E? Okay. Well, there's in 1955 there's a Robert L. and then in 59 a Leo. Okay, so that's how the name was spelled according to the records. So it was an AR on there. So that's why, you know, if you don't get the correct spelling, you won't get the name. So, but no, it's like I said, I can search pretty much anything.
Have you looked at all the teachers?
Not the teachers, but what I do have is when I went to Marywood, and my wife and I spent 2 full days there, and I scanned all the school records that they had. It accumulated to 282 pages. But what happened was in 1935, the Mother Superior at the time wanted just a brief or annals written of the school semester from September to June. And all it was is just a paragraph of that month and continued to the end of the year, to the end of the school year. And so I went and copied everything that they had. There's a few years that are missing in between 1935 to 1971. Well, actually, they go beyond that because they also covered the adult education up till 74, I think it was. So I copied all those records, and it comes out to 282 pages. And in there is a list of the priests that served at the time, the nuns that served at the time, and what position they held. You know, principal, housekeeper, whatever. All that was in there. And some of it's handwritten, others is typed, so it's a myriad of information, but it's 282 pages. So without going through a lot more searches, and I could go forever, but I know I can't. So I guess we'll end it at that point, or unless you have some questions. Any questions? Thank you.
We do have a few minutes if people have questions.
Let me just get this generator back.
Oh, so
He's busy. I comment about Monsignor Bolton. I knew his name. I knew it for a long time. I never, because he wasn't at our church, never interacted with him. And I was too young at the time. Looking back, he had just, where did he get all his gumption, his input, his knowledge, his go after it? This is amazing me.
And from, of 20 years of doing this research and stuff like that, and talking to parishioners, everybody loved Monsignor Bolton. I rarely heard anything bad about him. And he was very progressive in everything that he did. And the shame of it all is that once he left St. Joe's and went to St. Mary's, he wasn't there that long because he wound up dying at his cottage up north. So he had, I think, a heart attack or something like that. But, it was a shame because, I interviewed Father Lamar, who was one of his associate pastors at the time, and he just, nothing but good to talk. He says he was very progressive, and open-minded. So.
His voice was oh,
Oh, is that right? I did have the opportunity to hear him. So.
yeah, deep voice.
Please, I don't interrupt him.
You didn't need a mic.
No, I was going to say that as a graduate of St. Joseph's in the 60s, we were a progressive group of students. And in looking back, because of our diverse community, St. Joe's was, our student body consisted of Hispanic, African American, Irish, Germans, Polish, and we were a multicultural group. We were ahead of our time, but there was no thing as multicultural studies,
Right.
because we were the study.
That's true. We were living.
We were the study, and ironically, when I went to the university, like at Western, multicultural was coming into vogue, multicultural studies and the benefits. And I said, then I start to realize we've been exposed to that. We learn how to understand and appreciate each other and interact with each other,
Right.
and do things together. So when I went to campus, St. Joe's enabled me and prepared me and facilitated my wherewithal to get along with all people.
Yeah.
And that was, and I think that St. Joe's for a moment in time was the hub of multiculturalism. And I don't think that other parishes, and I don't say this negatively, but I think St. Joe's Parish was unique in that our because there was Sacred Heart, St. Mary's, Holy Rosary, St. Andrew's, St. Peter and Paul, and they had a sprinkle of
Right.
diverse group, where St. Joe's, we had it all.
Well, and the reason we had more than just the groups that I mentioned here is because what little parish was close to us by the Foundry? St. Rita's. Remember St. Rita's?
Yes.
Little community, but they only went up to the 8th grade. And so many of the other cultures that you mentioned were from St. Rita's that went and graduated from St. Joe's because it was the next church and a Holy Family, yeah. So, but a lot of that, is because, again, locale. Everything was there, and it was a very accepting community.
It was.
So,
We were, in a way, but now, talking about multicultural studies, that becomes taboo. We were that.
Yeah.
We lived that. We lived it. We interacted. And I really believe that St. Joe's, our faith, our Christian faith, the adhering to the gospel.
Mhm.
And I agree with you, I said, this Monsignor, that, he was way ahead of his
He
time.
was, right.
And he shamed the planning commission of the Saginaw.
Yeah.
So,
In a very respectful way. I'm sorry.
That's my
Is that me?
No, I think it's me. Sorry.
I wanted to make that comment.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it is 1 o'clock. This has been really interesting, really complex and important history for our community, for the whole city, I think. 150 years is a major milestone. So thank you so much for sharing.
She mentioned 150 years up on the screen. That's going to be the cover of our new booklet. That's going to be at the dedication. So that'll be the cover of the book. And notice what's in the middle of the top between the two old churches? St. Patrick. Because we start as an Irish parish.
That's right, that's right.
So I'm trying to blend it all into the cover.
We were in St. Joe's, we had a statue of St. Patrick there.
Oh, yeah.
And one day it disappeared.
But that was a stained glass window. If you went into the church, that's the original stained glass window, by the way.
Where
If
is
you,
that window, Jerry?
it was sold. It was sold. Remember when they tore the church down, they auctioned off all the stained glass windows. I would have loved to have bought that, but I couldn't afford it at the time. All
All
right.
right. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming out. There is a calendar of events on the back table if you are interested in upcoming programs. Hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank